Welcome to our TopTalk program. Tonight we have an interesting guest from Yerevan, Armenia, Professor Asbed Kotchikian. He's a professor of political science and international relations at the American University of Armenia, and he's now chairing the international relations and diplomacy department at the said university. Hello, Asbed. Welcome to our show.
Hello, Rusif. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for finding time. Today we are going to cover our regional developments, because in the past 3 years Armenia and Azerbaijan have repeatedly made headlines. Since September, the frequency has intensified even a little bit more. But I don't want to discuss whatever happens between Armenia and Azerbaijan just a bilateral affair, because in my understanding it has regional and geopolitical implications. So let's try to understand how the things have been developing in the South Caucasus. So in the last few years we have been observing the growing role of regional major powers in the shaping of geopolitics of our region. There are attempts to keep the West out of the region. The Western actors try to re-enter the region. So what are the major implications of this regionalization of international politics for Armenia and for Azerbaijan's regional standing? The floor is yours.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, making headlines is not always a good thing, right? Sometimes, a lot of better things can happen when you're not making headlines. But putting that aside, you're absolutely right, Rusif, in terms of your sort of characterization of the regional changes and the regional actors sort of becoming more involved. I think what happened is the 2020 war, preceded by COVID, but also with several factors, with Trump presidency and having a more isolationist foreign policy by the US, gave an opportunity for regional actors to play a more active role. I mean, when I say regional, you use the word regional great power. So basically we're referring to Turkey, Russia, Iran in essence. I think they found an opening for them to be more active. I think to a large extent, in this case, Turkey played a more active role as a regional power because of Russia's sort of issues with the West, growing tension, even if before Ukraine war. And after the war specifically, I think the 2020 war removed the Caucasus, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict from, and I have to have a disclaimer here. I'm an academic, I'm not a politician. So when I say Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, obviously, it's the nuances of Armenia-Karabakh. Is it Karabakh Armenia, and so on and so forth. Let's put that aside. We know what we're talking about in a context here. So I think there was a growing frustration on the Azerbaijani side from the OSCE process, which was completely comatose and not providing any need or any satisfactory advancement. And the war itself, I think, managed to put the regional conflict, Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, away from a Euro-Atlantic sort of context to very much entrenched in a regional context, in which at the beginning it was Turkey and Russia, the main players. But then Iran found an opening, because Iran has always been marginalized, even though it has a large stake in this thing. But because of American involvement in the OSCE and so on, it has always been marginalized. So now we're seeing a realignment of issues or realignment of players, external players, and this is what I think. We have to look at the South Caucasus in general, but Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict, mediation, peace approaches. Again, the words can have politicized meaning, but you know what I mean. Again, in a more regional context. So Russia, Turkey, Iran have become the major external actors in the South Caucasus, and it seems that it's going to go this way for a while. And Iran has actually, I find that Iran is becoming more and more active diplomatically and as being a partner also, maybe not as an important partner, as Turkey and Russia are players, but they're still a major player.
Yeah, thank you, Asbed. In this context, when several regional actors, including Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, try either to push out the Western external powers or resist their their engagement, we now see Armenia's attempts to kind of bring the West into South Caucasus. Now, Armenia's recent pivot to the West, it does not only generate enthusiasm at home, but it's also widely being celebrated in the West. But this pivot, this westward drift, it definitely comes at the expense of Armenia's historical ties with Russia. And of course, it certainly raises a lot of questions, not only in Armenia and Russia, but also elsewhere. Do you think this strategy is kind of viable for Armenia's best interests and national security like framework? Do you think Armenia is on the right path in this regard? I will put aside some political, economic, value-driven aspects of this conversation. I'm speaking about the security interests in this context.
Yeah. Very good point, Rusif. And I have to interject here before going on to that. It's quite interesting that, and this is something I was thinking about as well. When you mentioned regional powers, you talked about Turkey, or Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan. I'll come back to that in a moment. Again, I do understand.
Regional actors. So.
Right. No. It's not just about regional actors. Even you and I are regional actors because of the fact that we're just living here in the region. We're actors. But it is a regional actor, and I think this is one of the things that we can come back to that. We can come back to it if time permits. But I think after the war, after the victory that catapulted Aliyev into a more secure position in Azerbaijan, and I think to a large extent, I think also achieving what his father couldn't achieve, former president. I think these are important factors to consider to also understand how Azerbaijan sees itself now. It's a militarily power which has won a victorious war. It has an economic power and so on and so forth. So it does see itself as a regional great power. But in terms of the Armenian sort of westward sort of orientation or reorientation, Armenia has always tried to play that balance. Tried is the operative word between Russia and the West. In the early 90s, it was possible mostly because Russia was withdrawn. The West was trying to explore. So most of the countries in the region, they did have more leeway. But I think the key point to consider here is that these are about perceptions, okay? I don't know what goes on in discussions behind closed doors or even in front of closed doors. It's just an issue that I feel it's a perception. I think there's a perception in Armenia that the historical ally did not deliver in the 2020 war. Rightfully or wrongfully, I'm not going to discuss that. It's a perception, and perceptions matter in foreign policy making. Russia, the historical ally, did not deliver in the 2020 war. It did not deliver in the 2023 blockade, and then the eventual forced removal of the Armenian population. So there's that deep, deep resentment. Perceptions of resentment, but also resentment. Now, from that perspective, it's also, I think, to a large extent, in the case of Armenia and in also many countries, also in Georgia. Azerbaijan is a bit more nuanced. The security approach is binary. It's either Russia or the West, right? So that binary component, when you're disappointed from one, you go to the other side. This is something that we've seen during the Cold War. Egypt is a good example. Like they wanted to get money for the Aswan Dam, they didn't get it. They turned into the Russians, the Soviet, and so on. So that Cold War polarized situation, which is not necessarily the best approach, but Armenia did that and is doing that. And this is raising a lot of eyebrows in Moscow. But at the same time, it is making the Europeans take advances as something that this is a great opportunity for us to increase our influence in Armenia, but in the region as well. Georgia has been a pain in the neck for the West. I mean, they're the first to turn to the West in the early 2000s, but because of the internal polarization, the West doesn't know how to deal with it. It's like sort of somewhere in the middle, so they're trying to figure it out constantly. But in the case of Armenia, I think the West also has been, quote unquote, liberated from the burden to choose between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Because up until then, Armenians would claim that, why aren't you recognizing Artsakh as an independent state, and so on and so forth. And of course, the territorial integrity doctrine has always prohibited that. Now that issue is solved, and I use the word solved in quotation marks, I think Europe is much more comfortable getting involved with Armenia without any major sort of challenges to other countries, at least making other countries uncomfortable. How much it would result, or what would it result in, that remains to be seen. I feel personally that Europe is in no condition to provide security guarantees. It doesn't have the capacity. I think they can provide technical assistance. They can provide training, but they do not have the capacity that the United States or Russia or Turkey, for that matter, can, or India or China. The list can go on, but Europe can't because they're militarily, security-wise, they are dependent on NATO. They are dependent on the US still, even though they're trying to make headway separately. So I am not certain to what extent that westward sort of outlook for Armenia can provide that security guarantee, but it can provide the necessary cover for bilateral Armenia-Azerbaijan bilateral advances. I know we discussed, and I don't think this is a secret, I know we discussed about what are the general topics we want to talk about. Maybe I can jump in and bleed into this, the next part, which you can ask the question. Again, I don't want to, steal your thunder, but one of the things I strongly believe that the role that the EU or European Union can play is that in the case of bilateral Turkish, Armenian-Azerbaijani sort of negotiations, they can act as a guarantor, only if Turkey is also involved. Because we know what happened, right? Aliyev refused to go to Granada, and then also has reservations about Brussels, because the main argument, at least what was announced, was that Turkey is not involved. And we have to also keep in mind, sometimes what is announced and what is actually the reason are not always the same thing. So I think Europe has that potential to be the godfather of a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. On the other hand, Russia, Moscow has always been trying to do that. And don't forget, one of the initial 1994 ceasefire agreement was achieved bilaterally. There is more that you can achieve bilaterally than having a third party mediate. Well, mediation maybe, but we're talking about true mediation, not muddling and basically changing. So this is something that I usually say to European colleagues, be that in policy circles or in delegations coming in. Europe tries to be relevant without being useful. Okay. So they try to be relevant in the process, but they do have limitations. Even though I have to say that in recent 5-6 months or almost a year, they have made headways in terms of trying to get more and more useful, not just relevant, but useful.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Asbed, for this comprehensive analysis. Since you referred to the Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization a couple of times, now let me move to this part of our discussion. We are nowadays receiving some positive signals. This joint statement, the swap of prisoners, the countries' reassurances about their adherence to the peace process. Of course, all these are kind of injecting some sort of optimism. On the one hand, formally, the Armenia-Azerbaijan talks have been stalemated for some time, but as the recent joint declaration showed to all of us, the back channels never stopped. So there had been something going on, boiling,
Of course.
and right now, given the current circumstances, so how do you see, how do you understand our situation? Where do we go from here? What does it mean for the future of different mediation tracks and in general for the normalization process? Because as you just mentioned, Azerbaijan has its own preconditions for the Western track. It's either EU minus France, or it has to involve Turkey. Neither Baku nor Yerevan want to achieve something tangible within the Moscow framework. There is this Georgia option as an alternative setting. So what is your assessment?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Diplomacy is like an iceberg, right? You see only a fraction of what's going on. And you rightfully said that, while nominally or visibly there has been a stalemate, in essence, things never stop. I think they never stopped in general. It's just a matter of intensity and also rearranging and waiting for the dust to settle. The joint statement, I think, is quite interesting. And I believe it's an indicator. And if people are smart enough, policymakers are smart enough, because we know that there are a lot of policymakers who are not. But I think they might get an idea that, when it comes to bilateral track, let them solve their issue and we play a supporting role here. Let's see if they're going to get the message, the regional players. I think Iran definitely gets the message. Iran is always, I have deep sort of respect to Iranian diplomacy, regardless of which government it is. Russia might be a bit in a paranoid or uncomfortable position. I think Turkey might also let it be, but in close consultation with Azerbaijan. And Europe, probably they would. They're getting more and more sort of understanding about the processes in the region. So bilateral agreements or bilateral track seems to yield results. It seems to yield more results than multilateral or whatever it is, at least visibly. I mean, this is a general blanket statement, but I think it holds true in this case. What will happen? What could happen? And what could the potential prospects be? And first of all, coming up with a joint statement is a good thing. In diplomacy, even coming up with a joint statement is a pain in the neck, mostly because, you always end up, getting stuck on a sentence or a wording or a name or something. And I think this is a major thing. So they are talking, the diplomats or representatives are talking. But the question is, who is going to respond how? Which Brussels and regional governments, regional centers, how are they going to respond? This is the main challenge, I think. There has, again, I mentioned earlier, I interjected or I commented about your wording about Azerbaijan as a great power, and Azerbaijan does see itself now as a great power. I think the question is, if this bilateral agreement, if there were to be a bilateral process, let's not call an agreement is down the line. So if there's going to be a successful and fruitful bilateral process, this could open the door for Azerbaijan to be a regional power among the three countries. Almost probably, again, self-perception, that almost at the same footing as Iran and Moscow and Ankara, and Tehran, Ankara, and Moscow. But in order for it to do that, I think there are a couple of challenges, at least from both sides, some of them, and some part of them are from the Azerbaijani side. Change of rhetoric on the Azerbaijani side, which has been less and less aggressive and less militant, I think, since the end of the war, for the last couple of months. The other thing is how to prepare the population for an eventual peace agreement. And C, I think this is a common interest. I think the depopulation of Artsakh, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the people leading, the Armenians leading there, has rendered Russian peacekeepers there obsolete. I have felt this, and I know this, that Azerbaijan was never happy to have Russian peacekeepers on its territory. Now that there is no need for the Russian peacekeepers, what would Russia's role be in the region? They have become completely, I wouldn't call it useless, but irrelevant in this case. This is perhaps something that brings Armenia and Azerbaijan together as well. Armenia's, as we mentioned earlier, Armenia's disappointment with Moscow, and Azerbaijan's sort of reservations about having Russians on its territory. But sometimes in a process, it is also important to think about the disruptors as well as the facilitators. Europe might be facilitating and Russia might not, but Russia can be a disruptor. I think in this case, probably the leverage. There's a wide range, sort of widespread conception or saying or view in Armenia that what else can Russia do? They already screwed us over. What else can they do? Well, they can do more. Oil and gas. They can demand market prices, international market prices from Armenia for that. But I have no idea if this is even something that can be achieved or not. But just hypothetically, just throwing the question out there, maybe if there is a peace process, one of it meaning Azerbaijan providing oil and gas to Armenia, can you imagine how much more irrelevant Russia could be in this case? But Azerbaijan does play a careful game, does play a balanced game. They do not want to antagonize Russia. They are benefiting a lot from the Ukraine war in terms of the oil markets and so on and so forth, signing bilateral agreements with other countries. So I think this is a good start, surprising and good. Sometimes surprises are good. In this case, it was good. Other times they're not. When it's a war, surprise war, it's not a good surprise. But in this case, I think it's a good sort of first step in terms of starting a process. The question is keeping the momentum, and to what extent you will have facilitators as well as disruptors in the process.
Yeah. Well, Asbed, we refer to and discuss these positive developments. At the same time, this does not reject the fact that we in fact have negative developments between Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, stemming from these arms race or security dilemma. Because in the past few months, Armenia has been trying to diversify its military supplies, getting weaponry from France and India, new actors in terms of military supply in our region. Even in the case of the signing of a peace deal, could we see an arms race which can lead to another round of clashes between the belligerent parties?
Yeah, well, a major disclaimer, I'm not an arms specialist. I am not a security expert, whatever that means these days. But a couple of things that we have to be at least dismantle or dissect. First of all, diversifying is not the same as increasing, which is also happening. But this is one thing that we need to realize. Armenia's diversification, which Azerbaijan already had done before, because of its financial capabilities, I think it goes back to some of the issue or the issue that we discussed a couple of times on disappointment from Russia and so on and so forth. So trying to move away from that, that's one. But this is also, arms race is something, unfortunately, if you were to look at history, it is independent it has become independent of security dilemmas. It is a military-industrial complex. They are big companies manufacturing weapons of various sizes and so on. They need to sell. They need to sell it, and I think to a large extent, they have to. They will. There will be a constant flow of arms from all over the world into all over the rest of the world as well. So the question is, would an arms race lead to a conflict? That all depends on to what extent that bilateral track is moving closer and closer. To what extent you're going to be able to diversify your economy as well. I mean, don't forget that in the case of Azerbaijan, after decades of spending so much money on weaponizing, on buying weapons and so on and so forth, is it easy, even internally? Sometimes you have to also think about the internal mechanism. Is it easy for the government or the country to start cutting down on that budget? that they're spending on it. Soldiers like toys. Even though they might not have the final say in it, but all soldiers like toys, new weapons, new this, new that all the time. So if they act like children, you have to treat them like children. But then this is where the supremacy of the political power, political authorities has to be important to say, what? Yes, we are buying weapons. Yes, we are diversifying. But then also it all depends on where you're positioning those weapons, to what statements you're making. This is why we're getting into that waters where every single statement matters. Every single action matters. You go and, you start troop movements on your borders at this point, it can torpedo the whole thing. It can just go without it. So there is, I think, a further need of developing that confidence building measures and so on. I'm not excluding. I know that was an unanswer, Rusif, definitely. I don't know what the future will bring, but again, I think it's also a reality on the ground that arms, wet sales, and weapon sales is a big industry. And if you have a country, especially like Azerbaijan, who has billions of dollars to spend, well, I mean, obviously, it would be better to spend on social, educational, health issues, and so on. But you're going to have salesmen coming in, knocking on the door, Baku's door, and saying, oh, look, we have new drones. Oh, look, we have new weapons. This weapon, instead of killing someone 10 times, it can kill the same person 100 times. And but it's about salesmanship. And I think this is where keeping your eyes, both Baku and Yerevan, eyes on the prize, which is, well, first of all, a comprehensive peace agreement, the delimitation, demarcation of borders, and so on, and then building that confidence between them to create a really regional sort of dynamic. I mean, I don't want to sound like Martin Luther King, but I do dream that it's possible that three countries can align their security concerns. And basically say we do not want to have any security concerns from anyone in the region, be that Turkey, Iran, or Russia. But it takes three in this case to tango. I mean, if you're going to create a regional component, obviously you have to think about Georgia, but that's beyond the scope of our conversation.
Well, thank you so much, dear Asbed, for this super interesting discussion. Despite my eagerness to continue, I have to stop it here in order to save some topics for our for the next rounds of our dialogue. Thank you a lot. Hopefully, we'll be able to speak again.
Thank you, Rusif. Thank you for the opportunity.